Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly past velvet ropes into a world that was never meant for your eyes. Picture the royal bedchamber, thick curtains of crimson and gold hanging heavy in the warm candlelight, the air tinged with a blend of beeswax, rosewater, and the faintest trace of musk. The guards outside stand still as statues, yet their ears know the sounds that drift from within. You are here to watch the place where history's most powerful men surrendered to indulgence, where alliances were cemented in whispers and sometimes undone in the heat of a single night. You probably won't survive this without a little blush in your cheeks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you are right now, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk across thick carpets so soft they swallow the sound of your steps. The king's private world is one part theatre, one part temple. The bed itself is not just a place to sleep, it's a political stage. Every choice of who enters these velvet boundaries sends ripples through the court. To be here is to be part of the machinery of power, even if your role is no more than a shadow at the edge of the room. The mainstream historical fact that echoes through Chronicles is simple enough. In medieval courts, access to the royal bedchamber was strictly controlled, not just for security but because it was where influence was traded like gold. The chamberlain was more than a servant. He was a gatekeeper of secrets, controlling which noble or favoured guest could approach at intimate hours. Yet, what intrigues you most tonight is the quieter truth, how the room itself was designed to entice and intimidate in equal measure. Silk canopies embroidered with heraldic beasts swayed faintly with the draught from hidden vents. Candles flickered in polished brass holders, reflecting warm light onto the deep reds of the tapestry walls. Each thread told stories of conquest and divine right. But look closer and you might see something unexpected. A tiny stitched scene of lovers in a meadow, hidden low where only someone seated near the bed might notice. Was it a joke between the artisan and the king? Historians still argue whether such imagery was deliberate courtly humour or merely an overlooked embellishment from a mischievous weaver. And then there are the whispered tidbits, the fringe truths you won't find in the official annals. One courtier's diary describes a peculiar habit. The king insisted his bed curtains be drawn not by servants, but by whichever guest would be sharing the night, as a way to ensure willing hands closed off the outside world. It sounds playful, but here in this heavy silence, you sense the weight of ritual in it. The drawing of the curtain was a declaration, a moment when the chosen companion was acknowledged before invisible eyes. Of course, velvet is not only soft, it muffles. In a time before locks were truly secure, the layered drapes served both to keep the warmth in and to keep words from wandering beyond. That meant that political bargains, confessions, or flirty insults were all swallowed into the folds, safe from spies just outside. Or so they hoped. You can't help but think of the irony. In a place built for privacy, the most dangerous thing was often the person allowed inside. From where you stand, you can almost feel the tension between display and secrecy. The jewels on the bedposts are for show, but the small drawer hidden beneath the mattress edge, that's for something else entirely. Was it for love letters, talismans, or perhaps small vials of imported ambergris oil said to awaken desire? You imagine the king reclining here, still in his embroidered nightshirt, listening to a lute's last fading notes from the next room. The choice of who joins him is not a casual matter. Every noble family dreams of having a daughter or cousin favoured for even one night, for it could lead to marriage alliances, promotions, or, at the very least, gossip that shifts the tides of influence. And yet, it's not all political calculation. In rare moments, the man beneath the crown sought only the warmth of company without the weight of the realm pressing in. But you know, as surely as he did, that in this chamber nothing is ever truly private. The curtains may be thick, but rumours seep through stone like damp. There's a faint scrape, a servant outside adjusting a chair, and you realise how alert you've become. This is the pulse of the medieval palace. Right here between the heavy drapes, where history's grand stories are reduced to breath and skin and the quiet shuffle of feet. You are both witness and ghost here, knowing that one wrong whisper could end a career or a life. Perhaps that's why the air feels different. It's not just the scented oils and the warmth from the hearth. It's the awareness that every inch of this space has been stage-managed for effect. Even the shadows seem to have been placed with care, inviting the eye to focus where the king wants it, to overlook what he chooses to keep hidden. And you, standing here, realize that you are caught in the same spell as those who came before. The velvet curtains are not just fabric. They are the border between the ordinary world and a place where desire and authority mingle in dangerous, intoxicating ways. You have crossed that border, and whether you mean to or not, you will carry what you see tonight with you forever. You follow the hush of your own footsteps down a corridor gilded with candlelight, into a chamber where the air is thicker perfumed, heated, laced with the faint scent of roasted pheasant and spiced wine. The peacock throne stands not in the council hall tonight, but in this intimate salon, its high back gleaming with inlaid mother-of-pearl, each panel a shimmer of turquoise and green. The feathers carved along its sides almost seem to tremble in the flickering light, as though the throne itself anticipates the night's purpose. Here, banquets are not just about the food, they are invitations in disguise. The king sits not merely as host, but as a fisherman with a net of gold thread, each smile a cast line. Platters arrive laden with figs split open like secrets, their flesh glistening, pomegranates scattered as though carelessly, seeds like rubies hinting at fertility and temptation. You notice how each morsel becomes a message, a subtle cue to those gathered that pleasure and politics are about to intertwine. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward enough. Medieval royal feasts were stages for diplomacy, where alliances were brokered over shared courses and entertainment. But here, in the quieter spaces after the last toast, the throne itself becomes a signal. To be invited to approach it was to be marked for favor, and sometimes for something far more personal. A quirky tidbit recorded by a court chronicler tells of a particular king who kept a small silver bell under the armrest of his peacock throne. One discreet chime meant that a servant would escort a specific guest not to the exit, but to the inner rooms. The bell, innocuous to outsiders, was the hinge upon which many an unexpected liaison swung. Was it a clever tool for discretion, or simply a way to avoid awkward public gestures? Historians still argue whether this practice was common among monarchs, or unique to a few bold rulers with a taste for subtle theatrics. Tonight, you see the pattern unfold in real time. The king laughs warmly with a foreign ambassador, his hand brushing a servant's sleeve in what seems like a casual move, but you catch the faintest chime beneath the murmur of the lute. The ambassador's sister, dressed in layers of deep blue silk, is soon guided toward a side corridor, her eyes lowered, yet glinting with something unspoken. The banquet table itself is a carefully curated stage. Alongside the roasted game birds and sweetmeats lie candied violets, sugared almonds, and a spiced custard that sends cinnamon into the air. You catch yourself wondering whether the sweetness is meant to seduce the tongue into a more pliable mood. The wine imported from far-off vineyards is poured generously, its warmth loosening both tongues and boundaries. And then there is the music, not the raucous kind of a market square, but the delicate plucking of a lute accompanied by the soft breath of a reed pipe. It drapes the room in a layer of sound that smooths over silences, making private whispers less noticeable. The courtiers laugh at the right times, their eyes darting like small birds between plates and faces, reading the night's currents. You notice how the throne, usually a symbol of distance and authority, becomes almost conspiratorial here. The king leans forward, his robe catching the lamplight, his voice low but rich. Every guest at the table wonders, who will the bell call for next? There is an unspoken rule that the feast never truly ends when the last dish is cleared. Those who linger, under the pretext of sharing one more cup of hippocras, may find themselves drawn into smaller circles, where the conversations shift from trade agreements to stories that involve far fewer clothes and far more risk. The danger, of course, lies in the blurring of roles. A nobleman's daughter may become the object of royal favour one night and find herself bargaining for her family's lands the next. The same throne that grants a smile can just as easily withdraw it, leaving her vulnerable to the court's cold indifference. You watch as the king rises, not in the formal, deliberate way of state occasions, but with a certain feline ease. His hand brushes the carved feathers of the throne, a silent gesture that to the trained eye means the evening's public performance is over. What follows will not be recorded in official chronicles, but will be whispered in kitchens, guard posts, and ladies' chambers before the sun rises. And as the guests rise in a ripple of silks and murmured farewells, you sense the invisible threads pulling certain people toward private rooms, while others are left in the cooling air of the great hall. The peacock throne stands empty now, its carved eyes gleaming in the candlelight as though it knows exactly what it has set in motion. You step into a smaller, more solemn chamber now, far from the laughter and clink of goblets, where the smell of ink and parchment has replaced the scent of roasting meat. Here the air is heavy with the authority of scribes, not jesters. Marriage contracts, laid out on polished oak tables, curl slightly at the edges under the flicker of candlelight. But these are not ordinary legal scrolls. These are documents sealed not only with wax and royal crests, but with rituals that blend law and flesh. The mainstream historical fact is clear. In many medieval courts, royal marriage agreements were as much political treaties as personal unions. A king's choice of bride could secure a fragile peace, unite rival houses, or gain access to crucial trade routes. Every clause was weighed like gold, every witness chosen for loyalty and discretion. Yet beyond the heraldry and clauses about dowries, there was often a living seal, an act designed to bind the promise not only on paper, but in the bodies of those involved. One chronicler describes a ceremony where the bride and groom were led into a small adjoining room after the vows, not for consummation itself, but to perform a symbolic gesture, the bride placing her bare hand upon the king's chest, and the king tracing her name in ink across her palm. This public enough display reassured the watching nobles that both parties accepted the union in spirit as well as letter. Quirky, yes, but layered in meaning it suggested both ownership and protection. Historians still argue whether these gestures were genuine traditions or courtly inventions meant to entertain the witnesses and reassure doubtful alliances. Tonight, you see such a moment unfold. The new queen, her gown heavy with pearls, stands beside the king before the ink-stained table. A scribe leans forward, quill poised, ready to record the final line. When the last clause is read, speaking of mutual defense, the exchange of estates, and the inheritance of future children, there's a shift in the room's energy. The king takes her hand and presses it over his heart, his other hand resting lightly over hers. A soft murmur runs through the assembly. This is the gesture they came to see. The flesh seal could take many forms depending on the region and the century. In some courts it was a shared sip of spiced wine from the same cup. In others, the couple exchanged garlands of flowers that had been perfumed in the royal gardens. One particularly strange variation, mentioned in a merchant's letter, involved the king and bride exchanging rings of braided hair, each wearing a token of the other's body. Was it meant as a sign of unity, or simply a fad inspired by romantic poetry of the time? And yet, the intimacy was carefully staged. A marriage might be consummated later that night or not at all, if the union was purely strategic. In those cases, the contract in flesh acted as a convincing performance for the courtiers and ambassadors present. If the marriage was politically fragile, the theatre mattered just as much as the legalities. You watch as the scribe pours a small pool of hot wax, the red puddle gleaming in the candlelight. The king presses his seal into it, the crest's sharp lines catching the light. The queen follows, her own smaller seal beside his. The two impressions side by side, a pairing meant to endure, even if their affections did not. Around the room, ambassadors murmur in satisfaction, as though the world has just been made safer by this union. And yet, you sense the undercurrent beneath the surface. Some eyes in the crowd are too intent, watching the closeness of the king's hand on hers, searching for signs of real warmth or its absence. A single glance too long, a smile too stiff, could fuel weeks of gossip. In a court where alliances could unravel with a whisper, every gesture tonight will be remembered. When the ceremony ends, the couple is led to a high table for a quiet meal together, the rest of the hall politely withdrawing. The contract, still damp with ink, is placed in a carved chest in the king's private archive, alongside other treaties and promises. But unlike those parchments, this one has a memory attached to it, a human imprint that will linger long after the ink fades. As you leave the chamber, you can't help but think of how many of these contracts ended with crowns secure and kingdoms at peace, and how many ended in annulment, war, or betrayal. A parchment can burn. A hand pressed over a heart can be forgotten. But for one night, at least, the performance convinces everyone in the room that the union is not only legal but alive. The next space you enter is warm and low-lit, a world away from the parchment and pomp of the marriage chamber. Here, the king's quarters have been transformed into something almost alchemical, part apothecary, part harem. The air is thick with the perfume of frankincense, myrrh, and cinnamon bark steeped in oil. A silver brazier glows at the center, releasing delicate spirals of smoke that wind their way toward the carved ceiling beams. The mainstream historical fact is this: exotic perfumes and oils were among the most prized imports of medieval courts, arriving along trade routes that stretched from the Levant to the far reaches of India. Kings paid dearly for these rare scents, believing not only in their luxury, but in their supposed powers arousing desire, easing anxiety, and even warding off illness. To own such fragrances was to broadcast wealth. To use them on one's own skin was to announce that the crown's pleasures were of the highest grade. Tonight, you watch as attendants, dressed in flowing linen, move like whispers around the chamber. Each holds a small glass vial, delicate as a bird's egg, filled with amber-hued oil. The king extends his hands, and one servant begins to anoint his wrists, another the back of his neck, while a third fans the air to spread the scent evenly. A brazier's glow catches the oil and makes his skin shine faintly. This is not simply grooming, it is preparation for an encounter as carefully staged as a coronation. A quirky tidbit preserved in a monk's travel journal describes a king who kept an oil of paradise locked inside a chest beneath his bed. The oil, said to be made from crushed lotus petals and rare spices, was so valuable that it was only used before seeing a lover. On one occasion, the monk noted with scandalized fascination, the king ordered it applied to the inside of his gloves so that when he removed them before an embrace, the scent would linger like an invisible gift. Historians still argue whether the recipe was truly as rare as claimed, or if it was merely a clever piece of courtly marketing. The oils tonight are not merely dabbed, they are massaged in slow, practiced motions, each one following the lines of muscle and bone, as if drawing a map for someone else to read later. The attendants speak little, their movements deliberate, designed to preserve an atmosphere of quiet anticipation. Between each step, a new scent blooms in the room first, the sweetness of rose, then the sharper bite of clove, finally a smoky undertone from resin that clings to the skin like a shadow. In the far corner, a low table is covered with tiny carved boxes, each holding a different aromatic paste or powdered spice. One box releases the warm breath of sandalwood when opened. Another reveals crushed violet petals that have been dried and mixed with honey. The king runs a finger through the violet paste and touches it to the collar of his robe, a small flourish that will linger through the night. The purpose of these scents is not purely seduction. In a palace where dozens of people might pass through the king's company in a day, fragrance becomes a kind of signature, a way of leaving an unmistakable trace. If a courtier walks away from the king's side smelling faintly of saffron or amber, others know where they've been, and perhaps, if they are daring, what that implies. You notice that the chamber's warmth is deliberate, designed to open the pores and allow the oils to seep deeper into the skin. The brazier is stoked with a resin called labdanum, sticky and dark, its aroma almost intoxicating. The king leans back in his cushioned chair, eyes half closed, as if letting the scent do half the work of whatever comes next. And yet, you catch a flicker of calculation behind those heavy lids. The fragrance is part of a performance, just as the jewels on the crown are. It tells a story without words, of distant lands conquered or befriended, of caravans winding through deserts, of wealth so vast it can be poured into a single drop of golden oil. By the time the attendants step back, the king's skin gleams in the candlelight, and the room is a cocoon of scent. Anyone stepping inside now would carry a piece of it away on their clothes, their hair, their memory. And that, perhaps, is the point. Seduction here begins before a single touch, in the invisible threads of perfume that will trail behind the king long after the night is done. You find yourself in a long gallery draped with banners from past tournaments, each one stiff with gold thread and dusted with the faint scent of time. At the far end, an arched doorway opens into a chamber buzzing with a peculiar kind of anticipation. Here, the king's mistress lottery is underway, a practice so outrageous you almost doubt your own eyes. One well-recorded detail from the court annals reveals that in certain medieval kingdoms, the king's choice of mistress was occasionally presented as a formal selection process, cloaked in the language of festive games. Officially, it was a contest of wit, charm, and courtly skill. Unofficially, it was a thinly veiled audition for the most intimate role in the land. Tonight, the candidates are arrayed in a semicircle, each dressed in silks dyed in the most fashionable hues of the season: deep crimsons, emerald greens, and rich lapis blues. They are not only noble women, but occasionally the daughters of favoured merchants or foreign envoys, each hoping the night's outcome will change the fortunes of their family. The king lounges in a carved chair at the centre, one leg crossed lazily over the other, a goblet of spiced wine in hand. Among the stranger accounts buried in a lady-in-waiting's diary is the note that the lottery was sometimes decided by the king drawing a small token from a velvet pouch, rings, ribbons, or painted miniatures, each representing a candidate. The twist? The tokens were distributed to the candidates beforehand, who were free to enhance their chosen item with personal scent, embroidery, or a hidden love note, in hopes of swaying fate. Some researchers maintain this random draw was just an elaborate pretense, as most kings had already made their choice long before the pouch appeared. The gallery is thick with unspoken stakes. Winning the king's favour might mean estates granted to your family, your brothers appointed to high office, or debts quietly forgiven. Losing, especially if you'd been rumoured to be the favourite, could mean exile to a remote manor, your name forgotten in polite conversation. You watch as the king dips his hand into the pouch, his fingers lingering longer than necessary. A hush falls. When he withdraws a small ivory token carved in the shape of a swan, the woman it represents steps forward with a practiced bow, her eyes lowered just enough to seem demure, but her smile revealing she had always expected this. The rest of the circle curtsies in unison, masking whatever envy might churn beneath their jeweled bodices. The air shifts. The attendants begin to shepherd the other candidates toward the outer hall, offering polite compliments that ring hollow. Meanwhile, the chosen woman is led toward a side door, her gown sweeping the rush-covered floor. Behind her, the king's smile broadens not for the court, but for himself alone. It strikes you that this lottery is less about choice than about spectacle. The public draw gives the illusion of fairness, but the real game has been played in whispers, glances, and perhaps behind the shelter of those same banners you passed earlier. In this court, even desire is draped in ceremony, and every ceremony is a tool of power. The night deepens as you follow the faint strains of music toward a hall lit entirely by candelabras set high along the walls, their light shimmering against masks of every shape and hue. This is the kingdom's most whispered about diversion, the midnight masquerade. Here, identities blur, and the rules, at least for a few hours, melt like wax in summer heat. Court records make clear that such masked gatherings served more than a decorative purpose. In an age when the king's every word and gesture were monitored, The anonymity of a mask offered a rare space for candor, mischief, and the testing of boundaries. Some masks hid lovers from jealous rivals. Others allowed enemies to share a dance without the burden of open hostility. As you step further inside, the scene unfolds like a painting. Men and women move in slow patterns across the polished floor, the swish of silk and the glint of jewels creating a rhythm to match the low, steady beat of the drum. Each mask tells a story: a fox with sly golden eyes, a swan with silver feathers, a half-mask painted in the colors of a foreign flag. The king himself wears a black velvet mask trimmed in gold braid, his mouth the only part of his face visible, curved in a smile that reveals nothing and promises everything. One peculiar account from a traveling minstrel describes how, at certain masquerades, the king would carry a small ribbon hidden in his sleeve. During the evening, he would press it discreetly into the hand of one masked guest, a silent summons to join him in the palace's inner chambers after the final dance. Some say the ribbon was perfumed, so the recipient could find her way to him by scent alone. Academic debate lingers over whether this ritual was unique to his reign or part of a broader courtly tradition of symbolic invitations. The magic of the masquerade lies in the uncertainty. You see two masked figures in a heated, whispered exchange, perhaps rivals, perhaps strangers drawn to each other by the thrill of anonymity. Across the room, the king dances with a partner whose identity is hidden beneath a cascade of peacock feathers. Is she a foreign ambassador's wife, or a lady from the king's own household? Here, the question is half the fun. Even the music conspires to keep secrets. Lutes and viols weave melodies that seem to circle the hall, while the drumbeat pulses steadily, as if marking time for more than just the dance steps. The candles burn low, their wax pooling at the bases, shadows growing longer and more suggestive. When the final piece ends, there is a moment of stillness, no one eager to break the enchantment. Then, slowly, masks are removed, revealing flushed cheeks, knowing smiles, and the occasional startled glance as identities are uncovered. The king removes his mask last, his gaze sweeping the room as if measuring who is pleased and who is disappointed. But the real story is not told in that public moment. It is in the quiet departures through side doors, the whispered goodnights in shadowed corridors, and the scent of rose or sandalwood that clings to certain guests long after the hall has emptied. The palace is quieter now, though not asleep. Somewhere deep within its oldest wing lies a door of heavy oak, banded with iron, that only a handful of people are permitted to pass. You step through and find yourself in a narrow room lit by just 2 lanterns, the air cool and smelling faintly of stone dust. This is where the king's right of the first night, the so-called droit du seigneur, is said to have been invoked. It's firmly established in certain medieval legal charters that lords held ceremonial privileges over their vassals, though the actual existence of this specific first night custom remains one of history's most debated points. In some accounts, it is painted as pure myth, invented by later chroniclers to cast feudal rulers as villains. In others, it appears as a rare but genuine practice tied to displays of dominance and control over the land's people. You notice the architecture here is different from the rest of the palace. The walls are plain, the ceiling low, the light deliberately muted. A large, canopied bed stands against one wall, but unlike the opulence of the royal chamber, it is dressed simply woolen blankets, linen sheets, a single carved chest at the foot. The simplicity is unnerving. This is not a space for comfort. It is a space for demonstration. A strange reference survives in a mid-15th century steward's ledger. On certain nights, a marriage chamber was prepared here for the king, complete with a ceremonial cup of wine and a set of embroidered linens bearing the royal crest. The steward noted these events in the same breath as feasts and hunting expeditions, suggesting they were seen at least in that court as part of the king's public duties. Some researchers maintain these notations referred only to symbolic blessings of new unions, while others believe they hint at something more personal and physical. If you lean closer, you can almost hear the echoes of those contested nights. Imagine the young bride and her groom, summoned not long after their vows. Perhaps they were honored to be noticed by the crown, or perhaps their knuckles whitened in fear. A few would have emerged from this chamber boasting of royal favor, their family's status instantly elevated. Others might have left with their eyes averted, never speaking of what occurred between these walls. The ceremony itself, if we can call it that, varied widely in the records. In some regions, the king merely placed a hand upon the bride's head, offering a blessing meant to ensure fertility and prosperity. In darker tellings, the bride spent the night here before returning to her husband in the morning, the act presented as both a rite and a reminder of the sovereign's supremacy. You run your fingers over the wood of the bedpost, worn smooth by decades of use. Whether that use was symbolic or intimate, the result was the same, a visible reinforcement of the king's role as both protector and master. To refuse the ritual could mean political ruin. To accept it might open doors, land grants, titles, or positions at court, but at a personal cost few dared to measure aloud. One private letter, smuggled from the court to a distant abbey, tells of a newly married woman who was escorted here by candlelight, given a cup of honeyed wine, and asked to sit at the foot of the bed while the king spoke to her quietly about loyalty, honor, and the future of her family. The letter never says what happened afterward, but the tone shifts from polite detail to careful avoidance, as though the writer knew some things were better left unrecorded. The more you stand here, the more you sense that this room is as much about fear as it is about desire. The cold stone under your feet, the faint metallic smell from the iron door, it all feels calculated to remind those who entered that the crown was not only a symbol but a living force, one that could reach into the most private moments of its subjects' lives. Outside, the palace hums with normal activity, pages running errands, servants carrying trays, guards exchanging quiet jokes. In here, the silence is total, pressing against your ears. The bed's canopy casts deep shadows, and for a moment, you half expect the curtain to stir on its own. As you step back toward the door, you think about how a tradition's truth or falsehood matters less than the belief in it. Whether the rite of the first night was ever fully enforced, the mere possibility shaped behavior, tightened loyalties, and reminded everyone who truly ruled. In that sense, this room has done its work for centuries without needing a single witness to swear what they saw. The corridors twist and narrow until you arrive at a place most courtiers will never see: a small, unmarked door fitted flush with the paneling. It swings open without a sound, revealing a dimly lit passage no wider than your shoulders. The air is still and smells faintly of wax and damp mortar. This is the palace's invisible anatomy, the network of alcoves and spy holes built to feed gossip, safeguard the crown, and occasionally ruin reputations. Period building plans that survive in the royal archives show how some medieval palaces were deliberately designed with hidden observation points. These openings, small as a coin, or cleverly disguised as knots in the wood, were positioned to overlook chambers where decisions were made and secrets were shared. They allowed the monarch or his closest agents to witness conversations without being seen, sometimes for protection, sometimes for leverage. As you move deeper, the walls change from plaster to rough-hewn stone. Lantern light from behind you stretches in long, trembling streaks across the uneven floor. Ahead, a narrow slit opens into a view of a chamber you recognize, the antechamber outside the king's private bed. From here, you could watch the comings and goings without a soul noticing. Imagine how many eyes over the centuries have pressed close to this very spot, eager to catch a snatch of dialogue, a hurried touch, a name whispered in confidence. An unusual account from a dismissed court musician mentions these spy alcoves not in the context of politics but of romance. He claimed that one hidden panel in the music room allowed the king to watch certain performances unseen, not to assess their quality, but to observe which noble women lingered near the stage and which glanced too often in his direction. Whether this was fanciful slander or a glimpse of reality remains unsettled among historians. Your fingers trace the frame of one such peephole, noting how the wood is polished smooth at its edges from years of use. You can see enough of the chamber beyond to make out the velvet drapery and the soft glow of a hearth. In your mind, the scenes play out. A nobleman kneeling to present a petition, unaware that every word will be repeated before sunrise. A young attendant pausing too long at the king's side, her expression betraying more than formality. The deeper you go, the stranger the architecture becomes. There are steps that rise suddenly, only to stop at blank walls, and alcoves barely large enough for a single person to crouch in silence. Some are positioned near the great hall, others behind the Queen's audience chamber. These routes connect, forming a skeletal system beneath the palace's public face. It's here that truths are gathered, twisted, and passed along until they emerge in the daylight as half-believed rumors. One panel gives a view into a small dining room used for the king's most private suppers. You imagine the advantage of hearing which merchant has been granted new trade rights, or which baron is due for a reprimand, all before the ink dries on the decrees. But these same panels could just as easily be used for personal curiosity. Power here is not only about knowing what is said in council, but about understanding the subtler currents. Who blushes when, whose name is mentioned, whose gaze lingers where it shouldn't. The irony is sharp. While the alcoves were built for the monarch's advantage, there must have been nights when others, ambitious servants, scheming courtiers, slipped in without permission, turning the king's own eyes and ears against him. A single overheard secret could be traded for protection, money, or a swift rise in station. In one forgotten alcove, you find something unexpected, a shallow niche holding the dried stem of a rose, its petals long gone. Was it dropped here in haste, or placed deliberately as a marker between spies? The idea that these dark spaces held their own form of courtship feels both absurd and entirely possible. The palace's public rooms glitter with ceremony, but here in the shadows, truth and performance merge in a different way. Every secret overheard is a choice: keep it, spend it, or bury it forever. The walls themselves seem complicit, holding the weight of centuries of whispered names and half-finished confessions. When you finally step back into the main corridor, the contrast is blinding. Laughter and music drift from the banquet hall. Servants hurry past with trays of steaming dishes, and all around you is the warm, polished glow of visible royalty. Yet you know that just a few steps away, the silent watchers are still there, their eyes fixed through narrow slits, turning the palace's heartbeat into currency. The night has taken on a strange stillness, as if the palace itself is holding its breath. You follow a thin shaft of lamplight into a small chamber lined with shelves of parchment and narrow windows that look up to the stars. A heavy brass armillary sphere stands at the center, its rings catching the light in a slow gleam. This is the astrologer's sanctum, where the king's most private appointments are charted not by clocks, but by constellations. Accounts preserved in the diaries of royal secretaries note that in certain medieval courts, the monarch's schedule, especially his personal and romantic liaisons, was timed according to the readings of a court astrologer. These predictions were treated as more than superstition. They were woven into the rhythm of royal life. The position of Venus or the waxing of the moon could determine the exact hour a meeting took place, the mood expected, and even the choice of location. Here, a man in dark robes leans over a wide chart, the edges held flat by polished stones. He runs a finger along a line of symbols that only he seems to understand, murmuring as he marks a date with a drop of red ink. The king is due to meet someone soon, and the stars, at least in this reading, are aligned for desire, not diplomacy. One peculiar mention in a bishop's correspondence tells of a night when the king delayed an intimate meeting by several hours because Mars had not yet passed from the house of opposition. The letter's tone wavers between mocking, disbelief, and grudging respect. After all, the king was known for acting swiftly in most matters, yet here he waited for the heavens to give permission. Whether this was devotion to the craft or a convenient excuse for changing plans remains a point of quiet dispute among scholars. The astrologer gestures toward a low table where small bowls of colored sand are arranged in careful patterns, blue for water signs, red for fire, green for earth. Each bowl corresponds to an element said to influence the mood of the coming encounter. Tonight, the sands are mixed in a way that suggests warmth and receptivity, with just enough of the fiery red to hint at boldness. You step closer to the shelves, where scrolls are tied with ribbons of different colors. Some bear dates from years past, others from nights yet to come. These are the king's unseen archives, mapping a life of meetings, journeys, and encounters as if they were phases of the moon. In a way, they are each event carefully timed to ensure maximum advantage, whether in love, alliance, or both. The ritual begins simply. The astrologer lights a thin stick of incense, its smoke curling toward a narrow slit in the roof that reveals a patch of deep night sky. Through it, you glimpse a scatter of stars, bright and cold above the warm flicker of the chamber. He mutters a final set of words, sealing the hour as most favorable. The time is set. It's strange to think how many in the court believe themselves to be the sole architects of their fates, when in truth, their most important moments may have been arranged by the arc of Saturn or the slow drift of Jupiter. For the king, such consultations serve not only as guides, but as subtle shields. If a meeting ends poorly, he can blame an unlucky conjunction. If it succeeds, he can claim celestial blessing. One of the more unexpected notes in a faded margin of an old chart describes a night when two appointments overlapped in their planetary favor, forcing the king to choose between them. The record gives no name, only the phrase, "the swan and the falcon," as if the people involved were animals in a fable. The decision, it seems, was never written down, but the rivalry it sparked became part of court gossip for years. The air here feels charged in a different way than in the feasting halls or the hidden alcoves. There's no laughter or music, only the slow ticking of something unseen, cosmic, ancient, and utterly indifferent to human schemes. Yet, the king bends to it, weaving the patterns of the stars into the fabric of his most private life. When you finally step out of the chamber, you realize how much the night sky has shifted since you entered. The moon hangs lower now, and the corridors seem quieter still. Somewhere in the palace, someone is being summoned, unaware that the reason lies not in a whispered word or a glance across the hall, but in a decision made hours ago, under the gaze of constellations that will never know their name. The sound reaches you before the scent does a soft clatter of goblets, a muted burst of laughter, the delicate slide of a harp string. Following it, you step into a hall that seems suspended in a perpetual twilight, lit only by low candelabras that pool gold light on the tables. Here, banquets do not end when the trenches are cleared, they simply change shape. This is the wicked encore, the part of the evening reserved for those the king trusts or intends to test. Evidence in the household expense rolls shows that after certain formal feasts, a smaller group was invited to remain for private entertainments, billed discreetly under the heading of Musica et Ludi. These gatherings often combined music, poetry, and more suggestive diversions, designed to blur the line between diplomacy and seduction. If the main feast was a stage play, this was the after-party where the scripts were rewritten in whispers. Tonight, the air is rich with the sweetness of hippocras, a spiced wine served warm in delicate silver cups. The scent of cinnamon and ginger clings to the steam, mingling with the faint musk of bodies relaxed from hours of dining. The tables are smaller here, arranged so that everyone faces inward, conversation folding into conversation, until it's impossible to tell who is speaking to whom. One curious anecdote from a foreign envoy's memoir claims that during such encores, the king would sometimes initiate a game of forfeits. Guests would be asked riddles or challenged to recite a verse, and those who failed would surrender a token, perhaps a ring, a ribbon, or a lock of hair. The tokens, once collected, were displayed on a silver platter and returned at the king's discretion, often accompanied by a favor or a quiet summons later in the night. Whether this was playful tradition or calculated social maneuvering remains uncertain in academic circles. The musicians here play softer than in the great hall, their melodies more winding, less martial. A harp, a lute, and a single reed pipe weave an intimate net of sound that seems to catch stray glances and hold them a beat longer than necessary. Servants move like shadows between the tables, refilling cups before they are empty, offering morsels of candied fruit on silver picks. At one table, the king leans close to a merchant's daughter whose gown is the color of midnight velvet. His voice is low, but his expression is animated, his hand tracing a slow arc through the air as he speaks. Across the room, a baroness laughs a little too loudly at something her neighbor says, the sound carrying over the music like the ring of a bell. It's impossible to tell whether the king is conducting business or courting pleasure here. They are often the same thing. A slender doorway at the far end opens into a smaller, firelit chamber, where cushions are scattered in a loose circle. You glimpse a group seated there, passing a carved wooden box from hand to hand. Each person takes something from within and places it in the center, small, personal objects. A gold clasp, a miniature portrait, a sprig of rosemary. The king watches without participating, his gaze moving slowly from one contributor to the next. Perhaps the objects are offerings. Perhaps they are wagers. The mood in the main hall grows warmer, the laughter thicker, as the hour advances. The wine flows more freely, the music swells, and a certain looseness creeps into the posture of the guests. Deals are being struck here not with quills and seals, but with the silent contracts of glances held too long, with the press of a hand against another under the table. Near the hearth, a troubadour begins a song about a falcon who refuses to return to its master. The lyrics are clearly about loyalty and temptation, and more than one guest smirks at the pointed choice. The king, for his part, listens without interruption, a faint smile suggesting he knows exactly which courtly affairs the song is meant to shadow. As the night deepens, the edges between guest and host blur. A visiting lord sings a bawdy refrain in a voice too fine for such crude humor, and the king claps along. The merchant's daughter now sits closer, her shoulder brushing his sleeve when she leans in to speak. The baroness by the hearth has shifted to the cushioned circle, her ring now among the tokens in the center. When the last song fades and the final cup is drained, no formal dismissal is given. Guests simply drift away in twos and threes, some toward the outer gates, others toward the more private corridors. The king remains until the room is almost empty, then rises with an easy grace, his eyes scanning the shadows as if to confirm that the night's real work has only just begun. You leave with the impression that this encore is not an afterthought to the feast, but its truest purpose. Here, the kingdom is steered not by decrees and counsels, but by the fragile threads spun in a haze of wine, music, and carefully measured indulgence. The corridor turns colder as you move away from the warm hum of the encore hall. The air here smells faintly of beeswax and damp stone, and the echo of your steps lingers longer than it should. A guard in a plain surcoat steps aside without a word, letting you pass into a side wing of the palace seldom spoken of in public. This is where royal pilgrimages begin, and where they sometimes end in ways the chroniclers politely omit. Travel records preserved in the treasury's ledgers confirm that kings often undertook journeys to sacred sites, both within their realms and across distant borders. Officially, these trips were for prayer, penance, and the strengthening of alliances through shared faith. Unofficially, the long roads and temporary lodgings offered opportunities for encounters far from the rigid eyes of the court. The antechamber you enter is lined with travel chests, their brass fittings dulled by years of use. A map lies unrolled across a trestle table, its surface dotted with pins marking shrines, monasteries, and abbeys. But you notice something peculiar among the holy destinations are a few markers in small market towns, known more for their wine festivals than their relics. One dusty journal from a former steward hints that these detours were often arranged well in advance, with trusted intermediaries ensuring that certain houses along the route were ready to receive the king in private comfort. Tonight, the king is preparing for a pilgrimage to a distant cathedral said to hold a saint's finger bone. The air in the chamber hums with the controlled chaos of departure. Servants wrapping loaves in linen, a scribe checking a list of gifts for abbots, a knight supervising the packing of the royal tent. Yet, alongside the sacred objects, candles, incense, embroidered altar cloths, you see a discreet bundle of finer garments than the road demands. folded carefully in a chest. They are too delicate for dusty travel, meant for evenings behind closed doors. One surviving letter from a monk stationed along a well-used route tells of how the king arrived at the monastery after Vespers, stayed the night in the guest house, and departed before dawn. Yet the monk noted that a lady in a hood of crimson cloth left with the royal party. He wrote nothing of her role, only that her departure was blessed by no formal ceremony. Whether she was a courtier, a foreign envoy's daughter, or someone met on the road remains the subject of quiet conjecture among those who read between the lines. Pilgrimage travel blurs the boundaries of ceremony. Without the court's rigid seating charts and scheduled audiences, those in the royal entourage mingle more freely. Meals are taken in crowded refectories. Prayers are spoken in stone chapels where strangers kneel side by side. In such moments, a passing glance or a shared jest over a cup of watered wine can become the seed of a more private meeting. The road itself plays a part in the theatre. In villages, people line the streets to see the king pass, cheering and pressing forward to offer flowers or scraps of bread. It is in these moments of public devotion that more personal invitations can be slipped into the royal orbit. A note in a basket of apples, a whispered message from a local prior. You imagine the king's tent at night, pitched just beyond the monastery walls, lit from within by a single lamp. Outside, the guards speak in low tones, their breath clouding in the cool air. Inside, the tent is lined with carpets and cushions, the scent of pine from the surrounding forest, mingling with the sweet smoke of incense brought from the last holy site. Whether the company he keeps there is purely spiritual or something warmer is known only to those inside. And yet, the blending of sacred and profane carries risks. A pilgrimage is a public act. Any hint of impropriety along the route can tarnish its purpose. Perhaps that is why the most delicate meetings happen in the smallest hours, when even the monastery bells are silent and the road outside lies empty under the stars. By dawn the king will rise, kneel at the altar of the next church, and receive blessings as if the night had been devoted only to prayer. The journey will continue, its official record noting only the places visited and the relics venerated. The rest will dissolve into the dust of the road, carried away on the hooves of horses and the whispered songs of those who walk behind the royal standard. The scent greets you first: warm resin, polished wood, and the faint metallic tang of gold. You've entered the royal gift chamber, a place that serves as both treasury and theatre. In the lamplight, tables are arranged with almost military precision, each holding an array of objects. Heavy chains of worked silver, rings set with stones the size of sparrow eggs, bolts of silk dyed in colours so rich they seem to drink the light. Yet among these treasures lie others of a more personal nature, meant to pass from the king's hand directly into the life of someone he favours. Letters preserved in the correspondence archives reveal that such gifts were rarely simple tokens. A necklace might commemorate an alliance, but the clasp could contain a hidden compartment for a lock of hair. A gold cup might be inscribed with a devotional verse known only to two people. The gift itself was the public story. The hidden element told the truth. Tonight, the king sits at a low table, a casket open before him. Inside are smaller boxes, each lined with velvet. An attendant presents them one at a time, naming the recipient and the occasion, though both men know that occasion can mean anything from a wedding anniversary to the aftermath of a private evening. The king lifts each object, weighing it in his palm before nodding his approval, or setting it aside for a better match. A note found tucked into the memoir of a lady in waiting tells of a bracelet made from interlinked gold leaves. On the underside of one leaf was engraved a phrase in a language known only to the king and the recipient. To others, it was a fine piece of craftsmanship. To them, it was a message worn against the skin. Whether the phrase was a vow, a jest, or a warning is something no one has been able to determine. You watch as the king chooses a small, flawless pearl and places it in a box, already holding a strip of fine cloth embroidered with his crest. This combination will be sent to a certain young widow at court, ostensibly as thanks for her gift of a rare book, but in reality as an invitation. Those who understand the king's tastes know that pearls are his favored symbol of purity offered for restoration, a concept he interprets with generous flexibility. Around the chamber, scribes record each transaction with careful ink strokes. The records will note the item, the date, and the recipient's name, but not the story behind it. Those details will be left to rumor, which has a way of traveling faster than any royal courier. In the right hands, a gift can do more than seal affection. It can create obligation, sow jealousy, or set tongues wagging in exactly the way the king intends. One of the most curious relics displayed here is a dagger with a hilt wrapped in braided silk. Its blade is too delicate for real use, but the silk conceals a narrow strip of parchment on which is written a poem. It was once sent to a foreign noblewoman, who later became a valued political ally. Whether the blade was meant as a threat, a flirtation, or both remains open to interpretation. The process tonight is unhurried. Between each selection, the king leans back, sipping from a cup of spiced wine, his eyes half-lidded, as though weighing not only the worth of the gift, but the worth of the recipient. It's as much a performance for the attendants as it is genuine decision-making. Every nod, every pause, reinforces his role as arbiter of both fortune and favor. When the final choice is made, the casket is closed, sealed with a drop of red wax, and marked with the king's signet. Couriers will deliver the parcels under guard, but the true delivery will happen when the recipient opens the box and understands the meaning beneath the metal and gems. In that moment, the gift will stop being an object and become a conversation. Silent, potent, and known only to two. As you leave the chamber, you glance back at the neat rows of treasures waiting their turn. Each one is a story in disguise, a carefully chosen word in the ongoing dialogue between desire and power. Some will be cherished, some sold, some hidden away for safety. But all will carry a fragment of the king's intent, as enduring as gold and as mutable as rumor. The air grows cooler as you descend a narrow spiral staircase hidden behind the royal library's shelves. At the bottom, you emerge into a room lit by a single hanging lamp, its glow casting long, trembling shadows against the bare stone walls. This is no grand chamber, just a modest bed, a chair, and a small table bearing a silver jug of water. But the quiet here is heavy, like a pause held too long. Not every figure who slipped into the royal bed wore the crown. Historical court gossip recorded in the margins of chronicles or whispered in letters speaks of nights when someone else took the king's place, either to protect him from danger or to preserve an illusion. Sometimes the stand-in was a loyal bodyguard, other times a trusted courtier whose resemblance to the king was close enough to fool an unprepared eye in low candlelight. A striking entry in an old guard captain's journal tells of a winter night when the king was away inspecting a border fortress, yet the court believed he remained in residence. A double was placed in the bedchamber to keep up appearances, attended by dim lighting, heavy curtains, and strict orders that no one draw too near. The deception worked so well that even a favoured companion, summoned for a midnight visit, left believing she had spent the evening in the monarch's company. Whether she truly believed it or simply chose not to contradict the story, the captain never wrote. You can picture such a moment here. The stand-in reclines on the bed, wearing the king's embroidered nightshirt, his face angled just enough into the shadows. Servants move quietly, delivering wine or adjusting the curtains, careful not to linger under the steady watch of the chamberlain. The illusion is a fragile thing, but for the court's purposes, it holds. There were other motives besides safety. Letters between two high-ranking courtiers suggest that a stand-in might be used when the king wished to avoid an encounter without outright refusing it. The double would offer a night of conversation or more, and the recipient would leave with their pride intact, believing themselves still in favour. The court functioned on appearances, and sometimes those appearances required a little stagecraft. One peculiar object displayed in the palace armoury is a half-mask carved of thin ivory, painted to match a certain monarch's complexion and facial hair. It was small enough to cover just the upper half of the face, allowing a stand-in to maintain the illusion in poor light. No official record explains its use, but its existence suggests that more than one king may have walked the palace corridors when circumstances demanded it. The risks of such deception were obvious. If the truth emerged, the injured pride of a powerful family could spark scandal or worse. Yet the very danger of discovery gave these substitutions their potency. They turned private encounters into statecraft, with the double serving as both actor and instrument of policy. You imagine the tension for the one playing the role heart-pounding, aware that a single misplaced word could unravel the disguise. For the real king, there must have been a strange comfort in knowing that part of his life could be delegated like a meeting or a letter. The bed here is narrow compared to the royal canopied frame, its linens plain but clean. Perhaps that was intentional, lest to tempt inspection. A small niche in the wall holds a candle stub, burned down to the quick, and beside it rests a cup of wine, long since dried to a faint stain. The air feels thick with the memory of long-forgotten performances. As you turn to leave, you realize this room is as much a stage as any throne hall or banquet chamber. Its audience was small, sometimes just one person, but the outcome of its scenes could shift the course of alliances, preserve reputations, or shield the king from danger without a sword being drawn. In the shadows here, truth was malleable, loyalty was tested, and the crown was worn by more than one head, if only for a night. The sound of foreign music reaches you long before you see its source, deep, sinuous notes from a stringed instrument you can't name, punctuated by the bright jingle of tiny bells. You follow it through a corridor hung with tapestries of distant ports and caravans, until you emerge into a chamber alive with colour. Here, the court is hosting a masquerade of foreign courtesans, an event where diplomacy dresses itself in perfume, silk, and suggestion. Court travel accounts make plain that rulers often invited entertainers and companions from abroad, especially after successful campaigns or lucrative treaties. Officially, these women were dancers, singers, or skilled conversationalists meant to enrich the cultural life of the court. Unofficially, their presence tested the boundaries of loyalty, both the king's to his queen and the court's to its customs. The room is a feast for the eyes. Lanterns of painted glass throw jeweled light over silken cushions piled in corners. Incense burns in tall brass stands, curling into shapes that seem almost deliberate. The courtesans are dressed in a dazzling mix of styles, some in flowing robes of embroidered gauze, others in layered skirts that swish like waves with each step. Their masks are lighter than those worn in the king's own masquerades, thin veils that reveal more than they hide. A curious entry in the memoir of a foreign envoy's secretary describes how, at one such gathering, the king insisted each courtesan perform not just a dance, but a short scene from her homeland's courtship rituals. The performances ranged from solemn exchanges of garlands to playful challenges with fans or cups of spiced milk. The secretary claims one dance, in which a courtesan balanced a rose on her forehead while reciting a poem, won her a week's stay in the royal apartments. Whether this was diplomatic courtesy or personal indulgence is still an open question among historians. Tonight, the king sits on a low divan, the fabrics beneath him patterned with gold thread peacocks. He leans forward as each performer takes her turn, his expression that of a man weighing more than skill, watching for confidence, subtlety, perhaps even defiance. The courtiers gathered along the edges of the room murmur their approval, or envy, in equal measure. Some avert their eyes, others lean in greedily, as though hoping to absorb something of the exotic into their own carefully cultivated charms. The musicians weave their rhythms into the performances, shifting tempo and melody to match each woman's origin. A dancer from the Eastern Islands moves with precise, bird-like tilts of the head. Another, from the sun-baked southern coast, sways with slow, tide-like grace, the bells on her ankles marking each step like a heartbeat. The king applauds each in turn, his hands meeting softly, but his gaze lingering longer on some than others. You notice that this is not a purely private indulgence. Ambassadors stand at the fringes, their eyes sharp. They know that if one of their countrywomen is chosen for particular favour, It may strengthen their influence or complicate it. The courtesans, too, are not without purpose. Their wit and memory make them adept collectors of unguarded words and unspoken tensions. One small yet telling detail catches your eye. Near the musicians, a table holds several bowls of fruit arranged with improbable artistry. A courtier leans over to tell you in a low voice that each fruit has been chosen for symbolic meaning in the courtesan's native lands: dates for fidelity, figs for fertility, pomegranates for wealth and plenty. If the king offers a courtesan a piece from the table, it is as much a message as an act of generosity. The evening stretches on, and the performances grow bolder. A pair of dancers from rival territories take the floor together, their movements alternately mirroring and opposing each other. The king smiles faintly, as though enjoying the political theatre embedded in their steps. By the time the last song fades, the air is thick with heat and scent, and the courtiers are buzzing with speculation. Who will be invited to remain after the others are dismissed? Which ambassador will carry home a quiet victory? When the king finally rises, his choice is made without a word, just a slight nod toward one veiled figure, who steps forward as the rest lower their eyes. The musicians keep playing softly as the two disappear into a side passage, leaving the remaining guests to sip their wine and pretend they had expected this outcome all along. The night air carries the faint scent of jasmine as you approach a set of double doors carved with swirling lotus patterns. Beyond lies the royal bathhouse, a sanctuary of steam and murmured voices. Tonight, it is prepared not for the king's solitary reflection, but for a ritual as old as the palace itself: purification before indulgence. Surviving architectural surveys and court manuals confirm that in many medieval kingdoms, bathing was not merely about cleanliness. In certain contexts, it carried symbolic weight, the act of washing away not just dust and sweat, but any lingering shadows before an important meeting, whether political, ceremonial, or personal. For a king, stepping into the water before a rendezvous was a way to sanctify what came after, blending piety and pleasure in the same breath. The chamber glows with lamplight reflecting off white marble, veined with blue like frozen rivers. Steam curls up from the central pool, blurring the outlines of the attendants moving along its edges. They carry copper ewers of heated water, pouring it in slow streams over the smooth flagstones so the rising mist fills every corner. The king sits at the pool's edge, a towel draped loosely around his shoulders, his expression distant yet alert. An intriguing mention in a minor courtier's personal journal describes how, on certain nights, the bathing ritual included more than the usual oils and scrubs. The attendants, carefully chosen for their discretion, would prepare a mixture of crushed herbs, petals, and rare salt said to stir the blood and sweeten the breath. The courtier notes that these mixtures were stored in a small, locked cabinet beside the pool, opened only on nights when the king had business of the heart. Whether this cabinet still exists is unknown, but the journal's tone suggests it was more than idle fancy. Tonight's ritual begins with a slow pouring of warm water over the king's hair and shoulders. The attendants work in practiced silence, massaging his temples, rinsing his skin, and anointing him with oil scented faintly of orange blossom and cedar. The sound of the water echoes in the vaulted ceiling, a rhythm that seems to slow time itself. Nearby, a smaller basin holds rose petals floating on milk infused with saffron threads. The petals are lifted one by one and placed along the king's arms and chest, the milk leaving a sheen that catches the lamplight. It is a gesture at once ceremonial and intimate, a visible mark of preparation. The bathhouse is not just a place for the king to be attended, it is also a stage for the chosen guest's arrival. Sometimes, the companion would enter during the final stages of the ritual, their own hands joining in the pouring of water or the placement of petals. To share in the act was to be part of its sanctity, and it created an unspoken bond before anything more overt occurred. From a small alcove, you can hear the trickle of a separate channel feeding into the pool. This water is said to come from a spring beneath the palace gardens, prized for its clarity and believed by those inclined to such beliefs to carry blessings from the land itself. Whether superstition or clever architecture, it adds another layer to the ritual's meaning. The king cleanses himself not only in body, but in the spirit of the realm he rules. One curious artifact kept in the palace's hidden stores is a shallow bronze bowl with faint inscriptions along the rim. Deciphered by modern scholars, they appear to be invocations for vitality, addressed to both gods and the elements. The bowl's size and wear suggest it might have been used to scoop water during these prelude baths, perhaps poured over the king by the companion of the night. As the final rinsing ends, the attendants wrap the king in fresh linen, the fabric still warm from the brazier. The air smells of cedar, rose, and the faint mineral tang of the spring. A path of woven mats leads from the pool to a smaller chamber beyond, its doorway half hidden by a curtain of blue silk. The king pauses there for a moment, his profile outlined in the soft light, before disappearing into the space prepared for what follows. Behind him, the bathhouse returns to its quiet equilibrium, steam drifting upward, petals floating lazily, and the sound of the spring's trickle resuming its unending song. The gardens are silent except for the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional creak of a branch in the night breeze. You step through an arched doorway into the palace's most closely guarded refuge, a walled enclosure known only to a few as the secret garden. It is a place the king uses not for parades or hunts, but for moments that must be invisible to the rest of the court. Royal land records note this garden's existence without naming it outright, tucked under the bland description of private grounds for the sovereign's rest. Yet its layout is anything but ordinary. The hedges form twisting paths that lead not to fountains or statues, but to secluded clearings, each hidden from the others. Some have stone benches warmed by the sun in the day, others small pavilions with draped curtains that sway in the wind. At night, these spaces are lit only by lanterns, hung low among the branches, their glow filtered through leaves like the last light of dusk. The air here is thick with the perfume of night-blooming flowers, jasmine, moonflower, and white lilies. The scent seems almost calculated to sharpen the senses. Somewhere deeper in the garden, you hear water murmuring over stones, the trickle from a narrow channel that feeds a lily-covered pool. An unusual entry in a gardener's old logbook describes how, on certain nights, paths were quietly swept clear and the lanterns refilled with fresh oil long after the public parts of the palace had gone dark. The logbook also notes the planting of specific blooms whose petals released stronger fragrance when touched or brushed against, a subtle signal to anyone arriving that the king had been there first. Whether these plantings were an indulgence or an intentional part of the garden's design is still debated among those who study the court's more discreet customs. Tonight, the king moves with unhurried steps down one of the winding paths, his cloak brushing against the hedges. He pauses at a clearing where a small pavilion stands open to the night air. Inside, cushions are scattered over a carpet woven with images of birds and flowers, the colors muted in the lamplight. A table holds a decanter of wine and 2 crystal goblets, their rims catching tiny sparks from the nearby lantern. The guest's arrival is as quiet as the king's. There is no trumpeting announcement, no servant escort, only the faint crunch of shoes on the gravel path and a silhouette emerging from between the hedges. They exchange few words, but their body language speaks volumes. A pause just inside the pavilion, the king's hand resting lightly on the other's arm, a smile that belongs to neither court ceremony nor public greeting. In some courts, gardens served as stages for formal receptions. Here, it is the opposite. The hedges and pavilions are designed to keep the moment contained. If a passing servant were to glimpse a shadow or hear a low laugh, the winding paths would make it impossible to tell where it came from. One small curiosity rests on the edge of the pavilion's table, a carved wooden bird, no larger than a sparrow. Its beak is open, as if mid-song, and the faint scent of rose oil clings to it. The carving could be nothing more than decoration, yet a faded inventory list in the palace archives notes tokens for the garden pavilions, suggesting such objects were part of a coded system. Perhaps the bird signaled the nature of the meeting, or simply the king's presence. The garden's role in the court's inner life is easy to miss if you only see its daylight face. By day, it is a place for quiet walks, a retreat for reading or prayer. By night, it becomes a shifting labyrinth of intimacy and negotiation, where words are spoken softly enough to be deniable, and gestures can mean more than any signed document. The two figures in the pavilion lean toward each other as the lantern sways slightly in the wind. Beyond the hedges, the rest of the world feels impossibly far away. In this walled oasis, the only politics are personal, and the only witnesses are the night-blooming flowers, whose heavy scent will linger long after the footsteps fade from the gravel paths. The muffled strains of music guide you toward a side corridor you haven't walked before. At the end is a carved cedar door, half open, spilling a warm ribbon of light into the hallway. Inside, the space feels almost private, no sprawling tables, no grand throne, just a semicircle of low chairs arranged around a rug, as if awaiting a small audience. The air hums faintly with the tension of expectation. Records from the palace accounts reveal that the king regularly summoned musicians for personal performances, separate from the large courtly entertainments. These midnight audiences often featured only a handful of guests, or sometimes none at all beyond the chosen performer. The setting was meant to cultivate an intimacy impossible in the echoing grandeur of the great hall. Here, music could be a curtain shielding words, stirring emotions, and sometimes carrying a message without ever naming it aloud. Tonight, the king sits in the central chair, its high back carved with a design of interlaced vines. A small table beside him holds a decanter of deep red wine and a goblet that catches the flicker of candlelight. Across from him stands a musician with a long-necked lute, the kind favoured in southern courts. The player plucks a few tentative notes, letting them linger in the air before shaping them into a slow, deliberate melody. An anecdote preserved in a retired chamberlain's papers tells of how certain pieces were played only for specific occasions, an old ballad about a hunting falcon for moments of reconciliation, a river song for quiet seduction. It was said the king sometimes requested these pieces not for their music alone, but for the memories they carried. Whether the court saw these choices as coded signals or simply as preferences was a matter left to whispered speculation. The music tonight is low and winding, as if written to draw the listener inward. The king's gaze is fixed on the player, but his attention seems to drift beyond the room, into the spaces the melody is filling. A second musician, seated near the door, adds a soft undercurrent from a small hand drum, the rhythm so subtle it feels more like a heartbeat than percussion. Midway through, a servant slips in quietly, carrying a covered tray. Under the silver dome is a small arrangement of fruits and candied nuts, along with two delicate porcelain cups. The servant pours something pale and fragrant infused wine, perhaps before retreating into the shadows. The offering is not shared immediately. Instead, it sits between king and musician, a silent bridge waiting to be crossed. There's a moment when the music pauses, and the king speaks softly. You can't hear the words from where you stand, but the musician nods once before beginning a new piece, brighter, quicker, threaded with notes that seem to chase one another like playful birds. This shift is deliberate. The atmosphere in the room lightens, the air losing some of its earlier stillness. One detail from a foreign visitor's account comes to mind. She claimed that a personal performance often marked the beginning of a more private conversation, with the change in tempo signaling a readiness to move from music to words. If the king's mood was right, the musician might remain after the audience officially ended, perhaps even following him into the inner rooms. If not, the performance would end with a polite bow and a quick dismissal. The final song tonight fades like smoke, its last note stretching until it's almost a whisper. The king sets down his goblet and offers a slow clap, the sound more intimate than grand. He speaks again, this time with a faint smile, and the musician bows low. The cups on the tray are finally lifted, one for the king, one for the performer, and the two drink in a shared silence that feels heavier than the music itself. You slip back into the corridor before the audience ends. Behind you, the lute strings are quiet now, but the melody lingers, threading itself into the dark like a promise that may or may not be kept. The faint click of ivory pieces carries down the hall as you turn into a cozy chamber lined with carved shelves. At the center sits a square table set for two, its surface marked with a chessboard inlaid from alternating squares of dark walnut and pale bone. This is no ordinary gaming room, it is one of the king's favored stages for courtship disguised as pastime. Palace inventories note that the king owned several ornate game boards, many brought as gifts from foreign dignitaries. Chess was the most frequently recorded in the accounts, but tables for backgammon, merrills, and card games also appear. Officially, these matches were a way to show wit, patience, and mastery of strategy. Unofficially, they were an excuse for prolonged closeness, sustained conversation, and the occasional accidental brush of hands across the board. Tonight, the king sits on one side of the table, his robe a deep burgundy that gleams softly in the lamplight. Across from him is a lady of the court, her gown the color of fresh cream, sleeves gathered back to keep from disturbing the pieces. The room smells faintly of beeswax polish, and the sharper scent of the wine set on a low stand nearby. A peculiar note in an old steward's log describes how the king would sometimes alter the usual rules for these private games. A captured piece might be redeemed if the opponent agreed to a forfeit anything from reciting a verse to revealing a personal secret. The steward wrote that these games often ended with both players laughing softly, though the laughter sometimes carried an edge of tension. Whether the altered rules were a whim or a calculated tactic to break reserve remains a point of friendly dispute among palace historians. The game tonight unfolds slowly. The lady rests her chin on one hand, her eyes fixed on the board, while the king leans forward, elbows on the table, studying her face as much as her moves. Each time a piece changes hands, his fingers linger a fraction longer than necessary, sliding the ivory pawn or knight toward her with deliberate slowness. Beside the chessboard, a second, smaller table holds a set of carved wooden figurines, miniature servants, animals, and trees. These, you realize, are part of another game entirely, one where players create scenes and stories to amuse or challenge their opponent. It's easy to imagine the king weaving a tale that edges toward flirtation, the lady countering with her own clever twists, the conversation moving between strategy and subtext as naturally as breath. The wine is poured halfway through the match. They drink without breaking eye contact, the soft ring of the goblets against the wood marking a quiet interval. The next move is a bold one. The lady's rook takes the king's knight. He laughs, shaking his head, but there's no annoyance in it. If anything, the move seems to please him. A diary fragment from a lady-in-waiting recounts a similar scene. She wrote of a game that lasted until the candles burned low, ending not with a victory but with the board left unfinished, pieces frozen mid-play. The match was to be continued, she noted, though the next entry in her diary offered no follow-up, suggesting that whatever continued happened far from the chessboard. The match in front of you edges toward its conclusion, though neither seems eager to bring it to checkmate. The king stretches, leans back, and lets the silence settle for a moment. Then, with a single move, he places her king in an inescapable trap. Instead of pressing his advantage, he looks up and says something too quiet to catch. She smiles, tilts her head, and tips her own king over with one finger surrender by choice, not by force. The board is reset in silence, but you sense the game itself has already shifted into something wordless. In this room, victories and losses are less important than the space between them, where the real play happens. The air outside the gaming chamber feels cooler, but the sound that draws you onward is unmistakable. Laughter, high and bright, mixed with the deeper hum of drums and the occasional sharp trill of a flute. You follow it into a courtyard strung with ribbons and lanterns, their colors made richer by the firelight that dances across the paving stones. This is the Festival of Hidden Faces, a yearly celebration in which even the king can move unseen, at least for a while. Seasonal records in the royal calendar show that such festivals marked transitions in the year harvest to winter, winter to planting, or the midsummer turn. On paper, they were for the people, processions, feasts, and music in the streets. But the private version, held within the palace walls, was another matter entirely. Here, masks and costumes offered a license to speak boldly, act freely, and cross lines that in daylight would be carefully guarded. The courtyard smells of roasting chestnuts and sweet wine, of wood smoke and citrus peel tossed into the flames. Everywhere you look, figures are moving, some in elaborate disguises of feathers and silk, others with simple masks of painted wood. The king is here too, though it takes you a moment to find him. His mask is plain, almost rustic, but the way people give way as he moves marks him out as surely as a crown would. A peculiar note in a jester's surviving performance book describes how, during one such festival, the king hosted a hunt in which the goal was not to catch an animal but to track down a masked partner using only whispered clues. The prize, the jester wrote with wry understatement, was an audience of the most private sort. Whether the game was played in jest or with serious intent was left to the imagination. Tonight's celebration seems built for these subtle games. Groups gather and dissolve around the fire pits, their conversations shifting with the music. Dancers spin in pairs and trios, masks slipping to reveal flushed cheeks before being tugged back into place. The anonymity allows for risks: an ungloved hand resting too long on an arm, a question asked too directly, a laugh too intimate for two strangers. The king drifts from one circle to another, his voice low, his manner unhurried. At one point, he stops beside a masked figure in a green velvet cloak. They speak for less than a minute, yet when the king moves on, the figure follows at a discreet distance, as though the brief exchange was all the invitation needed. Music is everywhere: drums, flutes, and the occasional call of a singer weaving through the crowd. In one corner, a troupe of masked performers acts out a short play, its meaning hidden under layers of innuendo. The laughter it draws is half amusement, half recognition. You get the sense that many here are not watching the stage at all, but scanning the audience for their own private cues. A detail from a servant's oral history comes to mind. He claimed the Festival of Hidden Faces was the only time when the palace kitchens stayed open all night, feeding guests who came and went in waves until sunrise. It was a night when doors that were usually locked stood open, and corridors that were normally guarded lay unpatrolled. The implication was clear: some routes were meant to be taken without notice. As the night deepens, the firelight grows softer, the edges of the crowd blurring into shadow. Pairs slip away into the arcades, their masks still in place, their footsteps quick against the stone. The king is no longer in sight, and you wonder whether he has vanished into one of the upper galleries, or is simply another shadow among many. By dawn, the courtyard will be empty, the ribbons damp with dew, the masks left on benches or tucked into pockets as keepsakes. The official record will call it a night of merriment, of shared food and music under the stars. But for those who wore the plainer masks, or none at all once they stepped inside certain doors, the festival's true memory will be something far more personal, something that can only survive in silence. The celebration's echoes fade as you turn into a quiet wing of the palace, where the air feels warmer, almost heavy, and carries a strange scent, part spice, part something metallic and sweet. A narrow stair leads down into a chamber, with shelves lined in dark wood, each crammed with glass bottles, ceramic jars, and small packets wrapped in silk. This is the royal apothecary's private workshop. But its purpose tonight is not medicine, it is to prepare alchemical elixirs of passion. Court correspondence from the 14th century contains discreet references to tonics for vitality and draughts of courage, often delivered to the king before a feast or private meeting. While some of these were likely harmless mixtures of honey, herbs, and wine, others contained rarer, riskier ingredients: saffron for heat, ambergris for endurance, even powdered gold for what was believed to be divine vigor. The line between remedy and indulgence was deliberately blurred. Tonight, the apothecary works at a marble counter, lit by a single oil lamp, the light catching in the rippled glass of a narrow vial. He moves with measured care, crushing dried petals in a mortar until they crumble into a vivid red powder. Beside him, a brass kettle breathes slow curls of steam, carrying the scent of cinnamon and something sharper, more unfamiliar. The king sits at the far end of the room, watching without comment, a goblet resting in his hand. One curious entry in a merchant's ledger hints at an unusual shipment, a sealed chest, labelled only with the symbol of a lion, and containing small pouches of crushed beetles imported from a distant desert kingdom. The merchant noted that the order was placed directly by the crown, bypassing the usual channels. Whether the beetles were for medicinal, ceremonial, or purely personal use remains debated among scholars, though the timing coincided with a flurry of royal entertainments. The apothecary pours the powdered petals into the steaming water, followed by a swirl of thick, dark honey. He stirs slowly, the liquid deepening in color until it glows like garnet in the lamplight. A final pinch of pale crystalline grains is added, the kind said to be harvested from evaporated seawater during the hottest days of summer. The mixture is strained through fine cloth into a small flask stoppered with wax. The king takes the flask in both hands, not drinking immediately but holding it as if weighing its worth. This is not the first such elixir he has received. The ritual is as much about anticipation as effect. In some courts, to be seen drinking from such a vessel was a statement in itself, a hint to those who knew the apothecary's work that the night ahead was meant for more than politics. On a low table nearby, you notice other preparations. Small silver boxes of sugared almonds laced with clove and cardamom, jars of candied ginger, and a bowl of figs split open to reveal their ruby seeds. These, too, were believed to stir desire, though whether they worked by chemistry or suggestion is impossible to say. A record from a dismissed court physician offers a more skeptical view, describing such elixirs as naught but fine wine and fancying. Yet he admitted, grudgingly, that belief alone could work its own magic, especially in a mind already inclined toward pleasure. The king drinks at last, tilting the flask just enough to let the liquid touch his lips. He closes his eyes for a moment, as though tasting more than flavor, then sets it down and gestures for the apothecary to withdraw. The flask remains within easy reach, a half measure left for later. You realize the room is quieter now, the only sound the faint crackle from the lamp's wick. Whatever the elixir truly contains, its role is clear: to mark the night as exceptional, to signal that what follows is not mere routine but a performance worth preparing for. The bottles on the shelves gleam in the dim light, each holding a story sealed behind glass, waiting for the moment it will be uncorked. The staircase from the apothecary's room curves upward into a narrower passage, lit here and there by small niches holding oil lamps. At the top, you step into a space that feels both sacred and dangerous: the royal confessor's chamber. The walls are lined with shelves of worn books, mostly in Latin, their spines faded to the color of old parchment. A single high window lets in a shaft of moonlight that falls across a carved wooden chair, its seat polished smooth by years of whispered admissions. Palace annals note that confessors in the king's service held extraordinary influence. Their task was to hear the sovereign's sins and offer spiritual counsel, but the intimacy of those conversations often spilled into matters of state. The words spoken here were meant to be locked away in the vault of faith, yet not every confessor kept the seal as tightly as the church prescribed. The man in the chair tonight wears the plain black cassock of his order, but his eyes are sharp, quick to measure the king as he enters. They greet each other without ceremony. Here, rank is suspended, at least in theory. The king sits opposite, the two separated by a small table bearing only a crucifix and a brass bowl for holy water. A revealing entry in the letters of a disgraced nobleman suggests that certain confessors traded in what they learned, passing fragments of the king's private admissions to favoured courtiers. These leaks were rarely direct. Instead, they took the form of well-timed spiritual advice that just happened to align with another's ambitions. Whether this was deliberate betrayal or simply a loose tongue remains an open question in the historical record. Tonight's conversation begins quietly. The king leans forward, elbows on his knees, speaking in a tone too low to catch from the doorway. The confessor listens without interruption, occasionally bowing his head as though in deep thought. Then he says something brief, sharp, and the king smiles faintly, a smile that carries no humor but a kind of recognition. There is more to this exchange than penance. In courts where alliances shift like tides, a confessor can become a broker, shaping who is forgiven, who is punished, and who is granted the king's ear. The power is subtle but immense. A single suggestion here could change the course of a marriage alliance or the fate of a rival noble. An unusual object sits in one corner, a locked chest carved with the symbols of both cross and crown. According to a faded inventory slip, it contains documents of conscience, parchments written in the king's own hand, perhaps confessions he could not speak aloud. Such writings, if they exist, would be priceless in the right or wrong hands. The confessor pours wine into 2 small cups from a plain earthen jug. It is a simple act, yet it shifts the mood from formal to personal. The king takes his cup, their fingers brushing for a moment. They drink in silence, and you wonder how many truths are exchanged here without words at all. A curious note from a court cook's diary records how, after certain confessions, the king would emerge in a notably lighter mood and summon guests for impromptu feasts. The cook speculated perhaps shrewdly that not all absolutions were about sin. Some were simply the settling of unspoken debts. As the conversation winds down, the confessor places a hand briefly on the king's shoulder, an intimate gesture that could be comfort or quiet warning. The king nods once, then turns to leave. Whatever was said here tonight will not be recorded in any official ledger, but it will ripple outward in decisions made tomorrow, alliances formed or broken, and whispers that trace their way through the palace like smoke. The door closes softly behind them, and the room is still again. The crucifix and books the only witnesses to an exchange that straddles the border between salvation and strategy. You hear the distant clang of steel before you see its source, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat made of iron. Following the sound, you emerge into the tilt yard, its packed earth still warm from the day's sun. Torches ring the space now, their flames bending in the night breeze, casting long shadows of men in armor. The scent of leather, sweat, and horse lingers in the air, mingled with the faint sweetness of crushed grass. This is where knights of the Queen's retinue gather after the official tournaments have ended, and where rivalries often turn into far more personal stories. In the court's records, tournaments were proudly chronicled, lists of champions, prizes awarded, alliances celebrated, but the pages are silent about what happened once the crowd left and the dust settled. Contemporary poems hint that the tilt was not the only contest in play. A king's favour or suspicion could be stoked by who lingered near the queen after the lists were cleared, and the gossip that followed was often as sharp as any lance. Tonight, the king stands at the edge of the arena, his cloak drawn close against the cooling air. On the field, 2 knights circle each other with blunted swords, their movements precise, almost rehearsed. The queen watches from a low platform draped in blue silk, her ladies clustered behind her. It would look like an innocent display of skill, if not for the way her gaze keeps drifting toward one of the combatants. An entry in a court minstrel's songbook describes how a particular knight, newly joined to the Queen's household guard, won her notice during a midnight practice match. The song hints at a token of favour passed from her hand to his, a ribbon perhaps, or a glove which he wore tied to his belt for weeks afterward. Whether this was genuine affection or calculated display remains the subject of courtly debate. The match in front of you is clearly for more than exercise. The strikes are light enough to avoid injury but heavy enough to impress. Each time the favoured knight lands a blow, the queen's lips curl in the faintest smile. The king's eyes narrow slightly, not with open anger, but with the measuring look of a man cataloguing debts and allegiances. Beyond the torches, a few figures move in the shadows, retainers perhaps, or those who have learned that such matches are worth watching for reasons beyond sport. Here, a victory could open doors to the inner chambers. A loss might close them just as quickly. When the bout ends, the knights remove their helms, sweat glistening on their brows. The queen rises and steps down from her platform, offering a polite word to each before turning back toward the palace. Her favored knight lingers a moment longer, exchanging a few quiet words with another in the retinue. The king's gaze follows her until she vanishes into the torchlit corridor. A surviving letter from a visiting ambassador describes how, on one such night, a joust's victor was invited to dine privately with the royal household, a privilege that was not extended to his peers. The ambassador noted dryly that the dinner lasted well into the small hours, and that the next day's council meeting was delayed without explanation. As the field empties, the king remains for a while, speaking softly to his captain of guards. Perhaps they discuss security. Perhaps they speak of the match itself. Or perhaps, like so many conversations in the palace, the subject is something else entirely, wrapped in the language of another game. The tilt-yard falls silent except for the hiss of the torches and the slow cooling of the earth. Whatever began here tonight, envy, ambition, or something warmer will carry forward into the careful dances of the court, where steel is sheathed but tempers are not. The sound of trumpets fades as you pass from the tilt-yard into the great hall, now transformed into something stranger than a feast or a council session. At the far end, beneath banners heavy with embroidered gold, stands a raised platform flanked by tall candles. Upon it, a series of elaborate tableaux are arranged, knights kneeling, noble women in flowing gowns, all posed in careful stillness. This is the pageant of flesh and fealty, a spectacle where loyalty to the crown is displayed not just in words, but in the artful staging of bodies. Royal proclamations describe these pageants as demonstrations of courtly honor, intended to inspire devotion among the nobility. Yet accounts in private diaries and letters tell a more layered story. The line between homage and flirtation often blurred, especially when the participants were chosen for their beauty as much as for their lineage. The king's approval could turn a symbolic gesture into a very personal reward. Tonight, the pageant begins with a scene of martial victory. Young men in gleaming armor kneeling before the king, their helms set at their feet, hands on their swords. Behind them, women in silk stand as muses of the realm, their hair adorned with jewels, their eyes lowered. The tableau is frozen for a long moment before the herald's voice calls the next group forward. A curious note from a herald's manual mentions that the order of presentation was often adjusted at the last moment, sometimes to elevate a family in the king's favor, other times to test their patience by making them wait. On more than one occasion, this shuffling was said to be influenced by personal debts, whispered promises, or the king's own shifting moods. The next tableau is more intimate, a single figure kneeling before the throne, holding a polished mirror toward the king. In the mirror's reflection, his own image is framed by the glow of the candles and the downcast figure of the supplicant. The symbolism is clear loyalty as a reflection of the monarch's own power, but the choice of performer adds another layer. This particular participant, a young courtier from a minor house, has been seen at the king's side more often than protocol alone would demand. Music swells from the minstrel's gallery harp and flute, weaving together in a slow, rising pattern. The next scene unfolds. Pairs of courtiers, one kneeling and the other standing behind, resting a hand on the other's shoulder. It is meant to represent the bond between ruler and subject, but the physical closeness makes it easy to imagine another reading entirely. A fragment from a servant's memoir claims that after certain pageants, the participants were invited to a smaller, private gathering where the roles and poses were revisited without the constraints of ceremony. Whether this was courtly embroidery or a glimpse of truth is impossible to say, but the suggestion alone was enough to keep such performances alive in rumor long after the candles burned out. The king watches each tableau intently, his gaze lingering on some faces longer than others. When the final group assembles a circle of attendants surrounding a central figure dressed in the colors of the royal crest, he leans slightly forward, resting his chin on his hand. The herald proclaims the scene as unity of the realm, but to anyone looking closely, the arrangement has another symmetry. the central figure's posture mirrors the king's own, as though reflecting him in flesh rather than glass. When the last bow is taken and the platform cleared, applause fills the hall. Yet there's an undercurrent to the noise, a ripple of speculation about which participants might find themselves summoned before the night ends. The pageant has done its work twice over publicly affirming loyalty and privately planting the seeds of alliances, rivalries, and quiet invitations. As the audience disperses, the smell of beeswax and warmed silk lingers in the air. The platform stands empty now, but its impression remains an unspoken reminder that in this court, devotion is not always sworn with words, and fealty can be performed in more ways than one. The pageant's applause still hums faintly in your ears as you take a side passage toward the Queen's private apartments. The air here is cooler, scented with lavender and the faint tang of beeswax polish. At the far end of the corridor, the soft glow of lamplight spills from an open door, where the Queen sits with her ladies in waiting. To the casual observer, it's an ordinary evening, embroidery hoops in hand, hushed conversation drifting over the sound of a crackling hearth. But to those who watch the currents of the court, this room can be a chessboard in its own right. Household rosters from the palace archives show that the Queen's attendants were often chosen not only for skill and decorum, but for their connections. A cousin of a duke here, a niece of an influential merchant there. Their presence ensured the Queen was never without political leverage close at hand. But those same qualities also made them potential rivals, especially if the king's attention began to drift in their direction. Tonight, one of the younger ladies, seated closest to the fire, wears a gown in a shade of crimson that seems almost to pulse in the warm light. She laughs softly at something the Queen says, her gaze darting briefly toward the open door as if expecting someone. The Queen notices and pauses mid-stitch, her expression tightening for only a moment before smoothing back into polite neutrality. A passing reference in a visiting countess's diary claims that the Queen sometimes used her own gatherings as a quiet form of testing. By inviting the king into a room full of her ladies, she could watch both his reactions and theirs, gauging who lowered her gaze too quickly, who held it too long, and who seemed unaffected. The Countess hinted that such evenings often determined future appointments to the Queen's service. This evening the king does appear, stepping into the doorway with an easy smile. The ladies rise and curtsy, the rustle of skirts blending with the faint hiss of the fire. The Queen greets him warmly, but her eyes flick toward the lady in crimson for just a heartbeat. If the king notices, he gives no sign, moving instead to take a seat by the hearth. The conversation flows, polite and seemingly inconsequential remarks on the weather, a new shipment of silk from the coast, a brief discussion of the next Saint's Day feast. Yet underneath, there's an unmistakable layering of meaning. When the king compliments the embroidery on the crimson gown, the Queen responds with a story about how the fabric came as a gift from her own cousin, linking the compliment back to herself. A minor scandal recorded in the memoir of a former court physician recounts how, in one such gathering years earlier, a lady-in-waiting who had caught the king's attention was abruptly reassigned to oversee a distant estate. The official reason was her family's request, but the physician hinted that the Queen's hand was not far from the decision. In tonight's chamber, no such overt move is made. The gathering drifts toward a natural close, the king rising with a polite bow to the Queen and a few words of thanks to her ladies. Yet the tension remains, fine as a silk thread, the awareness that the Queen's circle can also be a field of quiet rivalry, where the game is played in glances and subtle turns of phrase. As the door closes behind you, the warmth of the hearth fades into the cooler air of the corridor. You have the distinct sense that while the Queen commands this space, every woman within it also knows she is being measured not just by her mistress, but by the man whose attention can shift the balance of favor in a single moment. The corridor beyond the Queen's apartments opens into a wide arcade overlooking the palace's inner parkland. The night air carries a faint scent of wood smoke from the hunting lodge at the far edge of the grounds. Down below, torches flicker along the path as the king's hunting party returns not in the orderly procession of the day's sport, but in a scattered, laughing knot of riders and servants. Hunts in the daylight are for spectacle. Hunts after sunset are for something else entirely. Palace activity logs show that certain hunts, especially those conducted under moonlight, were followed by private gatherings far from the main residence. The hunting lodge itself was small but comfortable, designed more for discretion than for storage of gear. It was a place where the king could host select guests without the rigid etiquette of the main court. Tonight, the riders dismount in a loose tangle of cloaks, boots, and steaming horses. The king swings down with easy grace, handing his mount to a waiting groom before clapping one of his companions, a viscount known for his sharp wit, on the shoulder. Another rider, a woman in a dark green riding dress, pulls back her hood and shakes loose her hair. Even from a distance, the way the king's eyes rest on her for a moment longer than on the others is impossible to miss. An account from a former falconer describes how the end of a hunt often blurred into an evening feast at the lodge. Guests would warm themselves by the fire, drinking spiced wine and sharing exaggerated tales of the day's chase. The falconer hinted that, on occasion, the king would lose himself on the walk back to the palace, accompanied by one or two guests who were never formally accounted for in the evening's records. As the party moves toward the lodge, servants light the interior, revealing a hall with rough-beamed ceilings and walls hung with antlers and hunting trophies. A long table is set with trenchers of bread, roasted game, and dishes of berries preserved in honey. The fire in the hearth pops and crackles, filling the room with the scent of pine resin and charred meat. The woman in green takes a seat near the hearth, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The king sits beside her, the viscount across the table. Their conversation blends with the general chatter, but the occasional low exchange between the king and the woman, too quiet for the others to catch, punctuates the mood like a drumbeat under a song. One intriguing item in the lodge's inventory is a carved wooden screen, light enough to be moved and placed wherever privacy is needed. Its panels are painted with hunting scenes, though the paint is worn in places from being folded and unfolded countless times. The falconer's account suggested that, when the screen appeared near the fire, it was a silent signal that certain guests would remain after the others departed. Tonight, the wine flows freely, and the torches outside gutter low. The conversation shifts from the day's hunt to stories of past seasons, to memories of other nights in this same hall. Gradually, guests begin to rise, offering polite farewells before stepping into the cold for the ride back to the main palace. The viscount leaves with the last group, glancing back with a knowing half-smile. When the door closes, only the king, the woman in green, and two servants remain. One servant begins clearing the table, the other tends to the fire. The screen is brought forward, set at an angle that hides the hearth from the view of the door. The woman leans toward the king, speaking softly, her hand resting lightly on the table between them. By the time the lodge's windows go dark, the rest of the palace will have assumed the hunt ended with nothing more than a feast. In truth, the hunt's real prize is often claimed here, in the quiet warmth of the lodge, where the only witnesses are the fire, the mounted trophies, and the night pressing in beyond the torches. The scent of pine and smoke fades as you step back into the main palace, where the air is sharper, carrying a faint trace of frost. The great hall has been transformed for the midwinter feast, a celebration that glitters on the surface but hides indulgence beneath. Tables are draped with heavy brocade, their edges dusted with pine boughs and sprigs of holly. Candles burn low in iron sconces, their light bouncing off silver plates piled high with roasted meats, sugared almonds, and wheels of cheese. Royal expense rolls for these midwinter feasts list vast quantities of food and drink, whole boars, barrels of hippocras, candied fruit from the southern coasts. Officially, it is a gift to the court and household before the year's turn. But letters from courtiers tell another story of nights when the boundaries between festivity and folly blurred, when the cold outside seemed to loosen every restraint inside. The king sits at the high table, his cloak trimmed with white fur, a golden cup in his hand. Around him, the hall hums with voices and the clink of knives on platters. Minstrels in the gallery above play a steady rhythm, occasionally interrupted by the jangle of a tambourine or the sharp crack of a drum. A carver moves down the table, slicing portions of venison so tender the meat falls away in shreds. One chronicler from a later reign preserved an account of a particularly infamous midwinter feast in which the king ordered the seating rearranged midway through the meal. Friends and rivals found themselves side by side. Strangers pressed into sudden intimacy, and by the end of the night, alliances had shifted as decisively as pieces on a chessboard. Whether that rearrangement was a spur-of-the-moment whim or a carefully laid plan remains debated by modern historians. Tonight's arrangement seems equally deliberate. The king has placed a visiting noblewoman, widowed, wealthy, and rumoured to be looking for a protector 2 seats away from him, close enough for easy conversation but not so close as to invite obvious speculation. Across from her sits a favoured courtier whose fortunes have been rising steadily for months. The glances traded across the platters suggest a conversation already underway without words. As the feast continues, servants bring out spiced cakes dusted with sugar, their tops glistening in the candlelight. Goblets are refilled with dark wine until the air is thick with its sweetness. The music shifts from stately to playful, and some guests rise to dance on the cleared space near the hearth. Cloaks are shrugged off, revealing gowns and doublets in jewel tones, the colours made richer by the fire's glow. A curious entry in a steward's winter account book notes the purchase of 3 extra sets of linens for the upper guest chambers on the very night of a midwinter feast. The purchase is unexplained, but the timing coinciding with the king's tradition of inviting certain guests to remain after the revel seems more than coincidence. The king now moves among the tables, cup in hand, offering toasts to the new year, and pausing to speak quietly with select guests. Each exchange lasts only a moment, yet the recipient's expression often changes: a surprised laugh here, a sudden blush there. When he reaches the visiting noblewoman, she rises slightly to meet him, and their hands touch briefly as he leans in to murmur something. By the time the last platters are cleared and the final dance ends, the hall is warm with heat and wine, the torches sputtering low. Guests begin to drift away in 2s and 3s, some calling for their cloaks, others slipping toward the staircases that lead to the private chambers. The king lingers by the hearth, watching the departures, his face unreadable in the shifting light. Outside, the snow has begun to fall, cloaking the palace grounds in white. Inside, the warmth of the midwinter feast lingers in flushed cheeks, in the faint echo of laughter, and in the quiet footsteps heading toward rooms prepared hours ago for endings the official record will never mention. The snow from the midwinter night has melted into a damp chill by morning, but the scent of roses clings stubbornly to one corner of the palace garden. You follow it to a small greenhouse framed in wrought iron, its glass panes fogged from within. This is where the king keeps his hothouse blooms through the cold months, rare flowers imported from far-off kingdoms, each more precious for having survived the frost. It is also where tokens of affection often begin their quiet journeys. In the official accounts, these flowers appear simply as part of the royal household's expenses, listed alongside fruit for the kitchens and herbs for the apothecary. But a handful of preserved letters tell a deeper story. A single rose, left on a writing desk or pressed between the pages of a book, could mean an invitation, an apology, or a promise. In some cases, the choice of flower was deliberate: white for innocence, red for desire, yellow for caution, or farewell. Tonight, the king stands among the trellises, the glass walls rattling softly in the wind. He inspects a row of crimson blooms, their petals open wide despite the season, warmed by the braziers burning at either end of the room. In his hand, he turns a single stem, studying it as though reading a line of text. At his side, the royal gardener waits silently, holding a small basket already lined with silk. A note in a dismissed chamberlain's records claims that certain roses were trimmed, so their thorns were left deliberately intact, a symbolic reminder that even beauty can wound. The chamberlain suggested, with cautious phrasing, that such tokens often carried unspoken commentary about the relationship in question. Whether this was the king's private joke or his method of setting boundaries remains unclear, The king selects 3 roses tonight, 2 red, 1 pale pink, and places them gently in the basket. The gardener withdraws, leaving him alone among the damp air and warm light. He walks slowly to a small writing table, set against the far wall, where parchment and ink wait. The note he writes is short, folded twice, and sealed with a single press of his signet ring. The wax is still soft when he slips it between the stems. In the silence, the greenhouse feels almost outside of time. You can hear the soft hiss of the braziers and the occasional drip of water from the irrigation pipes. Beyond the glass, the palace looms dark against the night sky. But here the king moves unhurried, as if savoring the control of choosing exactly what to send, and to whom. A curious mention in a poet's journal recalls a time when a rose meant for a favored companion was accidentally delivered to another courtier. The resulting misunderstanding led to 3 weeks of icy glances and hurried whispers before the matter was quietly resolved, though whether by clarification or replacement remains a mystery. When the king finishes, he places the basket on a small silver tray near the door. By morning, it will be in the hands of a discreet messenger, gone from the greenhouse as if it had never been there. But the scent will remain, trapped in the warm air for days, a faint echo of a gesture that might start a romance, mend a rift, or ignite an entirely new scandal. As he leaves, he pauses to brush a petal between his fingers, the softness there belying the sharp thorn just beneath. It is a reminder perhaps to himself that in this court, beauty and danger often grow from the same stem. The scent of the roses fades as you follow the king back into the warmth of the palace, where the corridors are dim and hushed. A faint hum of voices drifts from a chamber ahead, a private salon hung with pale silk and furnished with deep chairs around a low table. This is where the king spends his last summer evenings before the season turns. When the days are long, the wine flows more slowly, and the nights feel heavy with both heat and memory. Seasonal court ledgers show that summer was often the height of the king's entertainments, with open-air feasts, river excursions, and elaborate hunts. But as the year waned, the pace shifted. Letters from the period describe a softer, more measured mood in these final weeks, still indulgent, but tinged with a sense of drawing the curtain on the season's play. Tonight, the salon glows with the mellow light of oil lamps, their glass chimneys slightly clouded from long use. The windows are thrown open to let in the evening breeze, carrying the faint scent of the orchard beyond. The king sits with a small circle of companions, none of them strangers to the more private corners of court life. A platter of sliced melons and figs rests between them, glistening in the lamplight. An old lady in waiting's memoir recounts that during these last summer gatherings, the king often favored reminiscence over new intrigue stories of past escapades, told with a wry smile, old flirtations mentioned in passing, victories in love and diplomacy recalled with the same easy pride. Yet she hinted that sometimes such talk was less about nostalgia and more about setting the tone for what might happen once the night's company dwindled. This evening the king listens more than he speaks, his gaze moving slowly from face to face. When the laughter swells at an anecdote about a long-ago masquerade, his smile is warm but faintly distant, as if part of him is already elsewhere. A goblet of pale wine sits at his elbow, beads of condensation slipping down its side. One curious detail preserved in a painter's sketchbook shows the king in a similar setting, holding a folded fan unusual for a man of his rank at the time. The sketch's margin notes claim it was a gift from a companion present that night, its ribs painted with a scene only the two of them understood. Whether the fan was kept or passed along is lost to history, but the intimacy of the gesture was clear enough for the painter to mark it. As the evening deepens, the talk turns quieter. The king rises to stand by the open window, looking out toward the orchard, where the fireflies drift like slow sparks. Behind him, the others continue their low conversation, but their eyes follow his silhouette. There's a subtle gravity to him tonight, less the commanding figure of the feast, more the man who knows these hours are fleeting. One guest, a woman in a gown of soft yellow silk, joins him at the window. They speak in tones too low to catch, leaning slightly toward each other as the breeze stirs the curtains. The moment is unhurried, almost languid, as though neither wishes to break the fragile balance between conversation and silence. A small clock in the corner chimes the hour, and the king turns back to the room with a smile that gathers everyone in again. Yet when the gathering disperses a short while later, the woman in yellow lingers. They leave together through a side door that opens toward the garden, where the air is still warm from the day, and the night holds more promise than urgency. By morning, the court will move into autumn's business, new campaigns, new alliances, new entertainments. But for now, in the waning warmth of the last summer, the king claims one more night that belongs only to the season and to himself. The hush of late summer has passed, replaced by the stillness of a chamber where the air feels heavy, as though holding its breath. The walls here are panelled in dark oak, the windows shuttered against the outside world. A single candle burns on the table beside the bed, casting a small, flickering circle of light that dances across the king's face. He lies propped on pillows, his skin pale, his breath measured. This is a place for final words. Royal deathbed scenes are often recorded in the grand language of Chronicles, all solemn prayers and noble farewells. Yet letters from those who attended such moments tell a more human story. In these last hours, the distance between ruler and subject can collapse entirely. Confessions are made, secrets are released, and debts, emotional or otherwise, are settled in hurried whispers. Tonight, the room is occupied by a handful of trusted figures: the confessor, a scribe, two long-serving attendants, and a single companion seated close enough to touch the king's hand. The candlelight turns their faces into soft, shifting shadows. The king speaks in a voice that is quiet but steady, pausing now and then as though weighing each word. One remarkable account in a retired scribe's papers describes how a monarch in his final hours called for a former lover, someone long absent from court. When she arrived, he dismissed everyone else and spoke with her alone for nearly an hour. The scribe noted that the king's mood afterward was lighter, even peaceful, though what was said between them was never written down. Whether it was apology, gratitude, or one last indulgence of memory remains a mystery. The candle in this room gutters briefly as a draught slips under the door. The companion by the bed leans forward, and for a moment their foreheads almost touch. The king murmurs something too low to hear, then gives a faint smile, a rare expression now, but one that softens the severity of his features. The scribe dips his quill, recording only the formal words: gifts to certain retainers, instructions for burial, a blessing for the heir. But the real testament is happening in the unrecorded space. A glance toward the confessor that holds more meaning than a prayer. A squeeze of the companion's hand that lingers a heartbeat longer than etiquette would require. The attendants, trained to see without noticing, busy themselves with adjusting pillows and pouring water while absorbing every nuance of what will never be spoken outside these walls. A small wooden box rests on the bedside table, its lid closed. According to the palace's private inventory, such boxes often contained personal mementos: a miniature portrait, a ribbon, a letter sealed decades ago. This one has no label, but the way the king's eyes flick toward it suggests its contents matter more than any crown jewel. The air in the chamber grows cooler. The king closes his eyes, not in sleep but in the pause of a man gathering his last reserves. When he opens them again, he asks for the candle to be moved closer, as though wanting the light to mark these final moments. His voice is quieter now, the syllables stretching. The companion leans closer, their shadow merging with his in the candle's glow. When the last words are spoken, the scribe lays down his quill, and the confessor murmurs a prayer. The attendants step back, their movements slow, respectful, knowing the weight of what the night has carried. Outside, the corridors remain silent. No proclamation will be made until morning. For now, the room holds only the dim flame, the steadying scent of beeswax, and the residue of truths that will pass into history not as they happened, but as they are retold. The palace feels strangely hollow without the rhythm of the king's footsteps or the ripple of voices that always followed him. Yet, in the grand hall, the remnants of his reign linger like the scent of old incense. Candles burn low, their light pooling on the flagstones, revealing the emptiness of a space once so full of movement. Somewhere in the rafters, a draught stirs, making the banners sway gently, as though bowing to an unseen procession. In the weeks after a monarch's death, the palace breathes in a slower, heavier cadence. Official records swell with proclamations, inventories, and plans for the new ruler's coronation. But the unofficial legacy lives elsewhere in the stories whispered among the servants, in the glances exchanged by courtiers who once circled close to the crown, in the silences that fall whenever certain names are mentioned. One surviving note in a courtier's journal speaks of walking through the empty council chamber late at night and feeling the weight of the king's presence as if he had just stepped out. On the long table, the wax from the last council candle had hardened into shapes that looked almost like script, as if the room itself were trying to write down what it remembered. Tonight, you stand in the great hall and let the hush settle over you. Every corner of the space has held moments that will never be recorded. Private bargains sealed with a nod, lovers parting at the edge of a crowd. A smile flashed in defiance of protocol. The echo of those moments remains here, though their details belong to the past. Above the hall, the long gallery stands empty. This was once the king's favoured place to watch the festivities below, unseen. The windows along its length are shuttered now, but one is slightly ajar, letting in a breath of cool air scented with rain. Through it, you can hear the faint drip of water in the courtyard, a sound that feels both ordinary and eternal. A fragment of a letter, found years later in the binding of a book, hints that certain rooms remained locked for decades after his passing, not out of necessity, but because the new ruler preferred to leave them untouched. Some places, the letter reads, belong to him still. You walk toward the dais at the far end, where the throne sits beneath its canopy. Without the king's presence, it feels almost too large, its gilded edges catching the dim light like the memory of sunlight on water. The cushion bears the faint impression of where he once sat, and for a moment you can almost imagine the rustle of fabric, the shift of weight, as he leaned forward to speak. The hall is a stage between worlds now, neither fully in mourning nor ready to embrace the future. Those who served him know the currents that moved beneath the surface of his reign, the quiet negotiations and the nights that would never be spoken of openly. And though the man is gone, those stories will continue to pass in low voices, carrying his shadow forward in ways no monument can match. Outside, the rain quickens, drumming against the roof and windows. The sound fills the hall until it feels as though the walls themselves are listening. You stand a moment longer, then turn toward the great doors, knowing that when you leave, the echoes will remain woven into the stone, the wood, and the air, long after every witness is gone. And so, my friend, the candlelight dims, the hall recedes, and the stories slip back into their hiding places. We have walked through corridors scented with jasmine and smoke, listened to music meant for only one set of ears, and watched alliances rise and fall in the turn of a glance. The kings of those nights are long gone, yet the textures of their reign, the velvet curtains, the cool stone underfoot, the flicker of torchlight against a hidden smile remain vivid in the mind's eye. As the rain outside softens, imagine yourself stepping away from the palace, the air fresh and quiet around you. The world beyond is waiting, yet you carry with you the imprint of all you've seen, not just the grandeur and intrigue, but the delicate threads of human desire, vanity, and ambition that wove it all together. These are the true monuments, fragile, fleeting, and all the more precious for it. Let those images fade now, slowly, until they are no more than warm shadows. The road ahead is calm, the night deep, and the weight of history is lighter than it was. Rest well, knowing you have been both witness and companion to a story that has ended, yet will linger as long as memory allows.